Hidden deep within the surviving papers of antebellum Louisiana, buried under plantation account books, auction ledgers, and correspondence that was never meant for public eyes, lies a name that should have echoed through history. A man who stepped into rough-built fighting pits not once or twice, but 37 times, and walked out alive every single time, while none of his opponents did. No sheriff ever stepped in. No newspaper ever printed a line. And the men who made money off his brutality ensured that no official archive would ever reveal what truly happened. Everything you're about to hear comes from private journals, estate packets, and sworn statements that were intentionally concealed for more than a century. Before we go deeper into the story of the man whispered about as the Bayou Giant, I need one thing from you. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from, because you're not going to want to miss what comes next. The tale doesn't begin with bloodshed. It begins with a transaction, one simple exchange of property that set an entire chain of events into motion. In 1847, St. Landry Parish was a place where fortunes rose and collapsed with the sugar crop. Vast stretches of flat, humid land spread outward in all directions, broken only by cypress swamps and the occasional plantation house gleaming white against the heat, monuments to wealth built on coerced labor. The town of Opelousas, the parish seat, was a cluster of wooden shops, a courthouse, and a slave market that opened every third Saturday. It was a community arranged in strict layers. At the top stood the planter elite men like Charles Bogard Marchand, whose family had carved more than 3,000 acres of Louisiana soil into one of the region's most profitable sugar empires. Beneath them were overseers, merchants, and tradesmen. And at the very bottom, sustaining the entire system, were the enslaved men and women whose identities lived only in ledgers, never in memory. Marchand himself was a third-generation planter, 38 years old, with a reputation for both shrewd business sense and a particular hobby that set him apart from his peers. While other wealthy men bred horses or collected fine wines, Marchand had developed an obsession with what he called physical competitions. He attended boxing matches in New Orleans, traveled to witness bare-knuckle fights in Mobile, and had even journeyed as far as Charleston to see celebrated fighters perform. But Marchand wanted more than to be a spectator. He wanted to own the fighter himself. In September of that year, a slave ship arrived in New Orleans carrying human cargo from the Corollas. Among those sold at auction was a man listed in the sale documents as Samuel, approximately 24 years of age, of exceptional size and constitution. The description noted his height at 6 4 inches, extraordinary for the time, and his weight at approximately 230 pounds, most of it muscle developed through years of plantation labor. Marchand paid $800 for him, nearly double the going rate. The other bidders thought him a fool. Samuel had a reputation for being difficult, for resisting his circumstances in ways both subtle and overt. He'd been sold 3 times in 4 years, each owner eager to be rid of him despite his obvious physical value. The bill of sale included a handwritten notation: strong-willed, requires firm management. What none of them understood was that Morong wasn't buying a field hand. He was buying a weapon. The Marchand plantation sat 7 miles west of Opelousas, accessible by a road that turned to mud whenever it rained. The main house was a 2-story structure with wide galleries and shuttered windows designed to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the suffocating Louisiana heat. Behind it stretched the sugar fields, the processing mill, the overseer's cottage, and the quarters where the enslaved workers lived in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Samuel was assigned to the stables initially, a relatively privileged position that confused the other enslaved workers. Stable hands were usually chosen for their tractability, their willingness to accept their circumstances without resistance. Samuel was neither tractable nor willing, but Marchand had specific plans. For 3 weeks he did nothing but observe. He watched Samuel work, noted the way he moved, the controlled power in every gesture. He studied the man's eyes, looking for something he couldn't quite name, some quality that separated a man who would fight from a man who would merely survive. He found what he was looking for one October afternoon when an overseer named Dutch Keller decided to assert his authority. Keller was known for his cruelty, a man who used his position to indulge in petty acts of violence that had no purpose beyond his own satisfaction. He took exception to something Samuel did, or perhaps didn't do, and raised his whip. Samuel caught his wrist mid-swing. The entire plantation seemed to hold its breath. What happened next should have been predictable. Samuel should have been dragged to the whipping post, should have been made an example of, should have learned the fundamental lesson that resistance only brought worse punishment. Instead, Marcia himself intervened. He walked into the stable, assessed the situation with a single glance, and told Keller to leave. The overseer sputtered, protested, insisted that discipline had to be maintained. Marchand repeated himself, and this time his tone made it clear that the conversation was over. After Keller left, Marchand turned to Samuel. The two men regarded each other in silence for a long moment. Then Marshall spoke, his words carefully chosen. "I know what you are," he said. "I know you won't be broken, and I'm not going to try. But I am going to make you an offer." "Oh, avento sombrio." The offer was simple in its horror. Fight or watch the people you've come to care about suffer the consequences. Marin was not a stupid man. He understood that controlling Samuel through direct force would be impossible. The man was too strong, too willful, too capable of resistance, even at the cost of his own life. But he'd observed something in those first 3 weeks, something that gave him leverage. Samuel, despite every effort to remain isolated, had formed connections. A woman named Diner, who worked in the kitchen. An older man called Silas, who'd shown him which paths to take through the property. A boy of perhaps 10, who followed him around the stables whenever his own work allowed. Marchand made it clear, if Samuel refused to fight or if he lost, these people would pay the price. They would be sold separately to the worst plantations Marchand could find. They would be given to overseers like Keller with explicit permission to do as they pleased. They would suffer in ways that Marchand described with enough clinical detail to make his point. But if Samuel fought and won, they would be protected. They would be given extra rations. They would be spared the worst of the plantation's cruelties, and Samuel himself would receive privileges, better food, his own cabin, freedom from the fieldwork that destroyed men's bodies years before their time. The first fight was arranged for November 14th, 1847, in a clearing 3 miles from the plantation house. Word had spread among the wealthy planters of the parish that Marchand had acquired something worth seeing. 15 men gathered that evening, each bringing their own enslaved fighter, each confident that their man would prove superior. The ring was nothing more than a space cleared of underbrush, marked by torches driven into the ground at rough intervals. The rules were explained with brutal simplicity. Fighters would compete until one could no longer continue. No weapons, no mercy. The owner of the winning fighter would collect a purse contributed by all participants. Samuel's opponent was a man named Jupiter, belonging to a planter named Etienne Roussel. Jupiter had fought 3 times before and won each match. He was older than Samuel, perhaps 30, with scars that testified to a life of violence. Roussel had brought him specifically to humiliate Marchand to prove that size meant nothing against experience. The fight began just after sunset. What happened in that clearing over the next 17 minutes would establish the pattern for every fight that followed. Samuel moved with a combination of raw power and surprising control, each strike calculated for maximum effect. He absorbed punishment that would have dropped most men and continued forward as if pain were merely a distant concern. Jupiter fought with skill and experience, landing blows that opened cuts above Samuel's eyes, that bruised ribs that should have slowed him down. They didn't. The fight ended when Jupiter collapsed, his body finally betraying him. He was carried from the ring, breathing but unconscious. The plantation doctor who examined him later recorded severe trauma to the head and torso, condition critical. Jupiter died 4 days later, though the official cause was listed as fever. Samuel stood in the center of the ring, blood running down his face, and waited for permission to leave. Marchand collected his winnings, nearly $200, and afterward took Samuel aside. Their conversation was brief. Marchand asked one question: "Can you do that again?" Samuel's answer was equally brief, as many times as necessary. Over the next 18 months, Samuel fought 11 more times. Each fight followed the same pattern. Wealthy planters gathering in secret locations, their enslaved fighters pitted against each other for entertainment and profit. The winners celebrated while the losers were carried away. Of those 11 opponents, 8 died, some in the ring, others in the days and weeks that followed from injuries too severe for their bodies to overcome. The fights became events. Planters traveled from as far as Baton Rouge and Lafayette to watch. Stakes grew higher. Marchand's reputation grew with each victory, and he made certain to leverage it. He expanded his plantation, purchased more slaves, invested in new sugar processing equipment. The money from Samuel's fights provided capital that legitimate business alone could never have generated so quickly. But the true cost was being paid elsewhere in ways that would only become clear much later. Samuel kept his part of the bargain. He fought when told to fight. He won when winning was necessary, and in return, Marchand kept his promises. Dinah, Silas, and the boy called Marcus were protected, given better conditions than any other enslaved people on the plantation. They became a kind of extended family, the closest thing to human connection that Samuel allowed himself. Yet something was changing. The other enslaved workers watched Samuel with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw him leave for these mysterious trips, saw him return days later with fresh injuries that should have been debilitating, but somehow weren't. Rumors spread. Some called him blessed, others called him cursed. A few whispered that he'd made some kind of bargain, though with whom or what they couldn't say. The white overseers and workers developed their own theories. They gave Samuel wide berth, spoke to him only when necessary, avoided eye contact. Even Keller, who'd initially tried to assert dominance, now treated Samuel with wary respect. It was an unnatural dynamic in a system built on the absolute subordination of black bodies to white authority, and it created tension that ran through the plantation like an underground current. Marchand himself seemed immune to these concerns. He was making money, gaining prestige among his peers, building an empire on the foundation of one man's fists. He kept detailed records of every fight in a leather-bound journal, noting opponents, locations, amounts wagered, and won. He recorded Samuel's diet, his training regimen, his physical condition before and after each fight. To Marchand, this was simply good business, maintaining a valuable asset, maximizing return on investment. What he failed to notice, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the way Samuel looked at him, the calculation behind those eyes, the patience. By the spring of 1849, Samuel had fought 19 times, 19 victories, 14 dead opponents. The remaining 5 were left with injuries that ensured they would never fight again, never work at full capacity, never be anything but damaged property in the eyes of their owners. The 20th fight was scheduled for April 23rd on a plantation near Krotz Springs. The opponent was a man called Cato, belonging to a planter named James Wesley Thorne. Thorne was relatively new to the area, having moved from Georgia the previous year, and he brought Cato specifically for this purpose. Cato had supposedly killed 6 men in Georgia before Thorne relocated, each fight adding to his fearsome reputation. The purse for this fight was $500, an extraordinary sum that reflected the stakes involved. Thorne had been spreading word that Cato was unbeatable, that Samuel's streak would end on the evening of April 23rd. Other planters took sides, placed side bets, arrived at the designated clearing with an excitement that bordered on bloodlust. The ring was marked in a grove of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Torches cast flickering shadows across the gathered crowd. Samuel and Cato faced each other as the rules were recited. Rules that everyone present knew were meaningless, since the only rule that truly mattered was survival. The fight lasted 23 minutes. Cato was everything Thorne had promised. Powerful, experienced, ruthless, he fought with a style that suggested formal training. Someone who'd been taught by men who understood boxing as more than simple brawling. He targeted specific areas, worked to disable Samuel's arms, aimed strikes at vulnerable points that would accumulate damage over time. For the first time since the initial fight with Jupiter, Samuel seemed to be in genuine danger. Cato landed combinations that staggered him, opened a cut over his left eye that bled profusely enough to impair his vision. The crowd noise shifted, sensing that they might witness Samuel's first defeat. But something happened in the 16th minute of the fight. Cato landed a particularly devastating blow to Samuel's ribs, a strike that produced an audible crack. Samuel dropped to one knee. Thorne was already celebrating. Marchand's face had gone pale. The other spectators leaned forward, certain they were about to see the end. Samuel stood back up. What happened next was described in multiple journals and letters written by men who were present that night, and their accounts align in every significant detail. Samuel didn't just continue fighting, he transformed. The methodical approach gave way to something more primal, more terrifying. He absorbed Cato's strikes as if they were irrelevant and responded with a violence that seemed to transcend normal human capacity. The fight ended when Samuel landed a blow to Cato's temple that everyone present heard. Cato was dead before he hit the ground. The clearing went silent. Even the sounds of the Louisiana night, the frogs, the insects, the distant calls of night birds seemed to stop. Samuel stood over Cato's body, his chest heaving, blood covering most of his face and torso. When he finally looked up at the crowd, several men stepped back involuntarily. Morang collected his winnings, but for the first time he seemed uncertain. He'd witnessed something that night that troubled him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. On the ride back to the plantation, he kept glancing at Samuel as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You could have ended it sooner," Mang finally said. "You were playing with him." Samuel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet but carried perfect clarity. "I was teaching him something and everyone who watched." "What were you teaching?" "That I can't be beaten." Something in those words made Marshall uneasy, though he couldn't quite identify why. He'd wanted Samuel to be undefeatable. That was the entire point of this enterprise. But there was a difference between winning fights and what he'd witnessed that night. A difference between controlled violence and something that felt almost like revelation. They returned to the plantation in silence. And, for the next several days, Marchand found himself reviewing his journal, reading through his meticulous notes, trying to find the moment when things had shifted. When had this stopped being about profit and started becoming something else? When had Samuel stopped being merely dangerous and become something more troubling? He never found a satisfactory answer. And by the time he realized he should have been looking for one, it was already too late. The fight with Cato changed the dynamic in ways that rippled outward from that grove of live oaks. Word spread through the network of plantations carried by enslaved workers who communicated through channels their owners could never fully monitor. Stories grew in the telling. Samuel wasn't just strong, he was unstoppable. He wasn't just skilled, he was somehow protected. The specifics varied, but the core message remained consistent. Here was a man who'd found a way to be free even while enslaved. For some, this was inspiration. For others, it was terror. Marchand received offers from planters throughout Louisiana and into Mississippi. They wanted to see Samuel fight. They wanted to test their own fighters against him. They wanted to be part of the spectacle that had become legendary across the region. Marchand accepted these challenges selectively, always negotiating for higher stakes, always extracting maximum value from each event. Between April 1849 and September 1850, Samuel fought 12 more times, 12 victories, 10 additional deaths. The two survivors were so badly injured that their owners wrote off the losses in their ledgers, selling them at a fraction of their original value to buyers who needed labor too desperate to care about broken men. But something else was happening, something that wouldn't become clear until much later. Samuel was learning. Each fight taught him about the men who owned him and men like him. Each gathering of planters revealed details about their businesses, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. He listened during those torchlit evenings, standing silent in the ring before fights began, hearing wealthy men boast about their holdings, complain about their competitors, discuss matters they never would have mentioned in front of enslaved workers they considered fully human. They'd made a fundamental error. They'd given Samuel proximity to power while assuming he remained powerless. By the fall of 1850, Marchand's plantation was among the most profitable in Street Landry Parish. He'd used the money from Samuel's fights to expand operations, purchase additional land, and establish himself among the planter elite. He built a new wing onto the main house, imported furniture from France, sent his oldest son to study in New Orleans. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred carelessness. The 32nd fight was scheduled for October 19th, 1850, on a plantation near New Iberia. The opponent was a man named Caesar, who belonged to a planter named Vincent Laframus. Laframus was known for his cruelty even among men who built their wealth on human suffering. He'd gone through 7 enslaved fighters before Caesar, each one discarded when they no longer served his purposes. Caesar himself had survived 4 fights, killing 3 opponents and permanently crippling the 4th. The purse was $750, the highest yet. More than 50 spectators gathered, creating the largest crowd Samuel had faced. Stakes were high enough that some planters had mortgaged property to cover their wages. The fight began at dusk and lasted 31 minutes. Caesar fought with a desperation that transcended normal survival instinct. He understood, as all the enslaved fighters understood, that defeat meant death or something close to it. He was skilled, powerful, and absolutely committed to surviving this encounter at any cost. But Samuel had fought 31 times before. 31 victories, 24 deaths. He'd learned something that Caesar hadn't, that the fight wasn't really between them. It was between the men who owned them, the men who wagered on their bodies, the men who would profit either way from their pain. The fight ended when Samuel maneuvered Caesar into a position where the final blow became inevitable. Caesar fell and didn't rise. The plantation doctor pronounced him dead at the scene. Samuel stood in the ring waiting for permission to leave when something unexpected happened. One of the enslaved workers who'd been forced to attend, a man named Benjamin who belonged to a planter named Collier, stepped forward and spoke directly to Samuel. It was a violation of every rule, every protocol. Several overseers moved to intervene, but something in the moment made them hesitate. "How many?" Benjamin asked. Samuel understood the question. 32. "And you still here?" It was a brief exchange, no more than a few seconds, but every enslaved person present understood its significance. Samuel wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Not the fights themselves, which were meaningless, but something larger, something about refusing to be destroyed by a system designed to destroy him. The overseers finally moved to separate them, but the moment had already happened. As Samuel left the ring, several other enslaved workers met his eyes, a direct look that would normally result in punishment. The message was clear. They saw him. They understood. Marchand collected his winnings and departed quickly, sensing that the atmosphere had shifted in ways he didn't fully comprehend. On the journey back to his plantation, he finally articulated the concern that had been growing since the fight with Cato. "This needs to stop." Samuel, sitting in the wagon bed with his hands bound, a precaution Marchand had recently instituted, didn't respond. "I mean it," Marchand continued, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Samuel or himself. "This has gone too far." But of course it hadn't gone far enough. Not yet. The problem with creating a legend is that legends develop their own momentum. Marchand wanted to stop arranging fights, wanted to step back from the enterprise that had made him wealthy, but increasingly uncomfortable. But the other planters wouldn't allow it. They'd invested in this spectacle, built their own reputations around their association with it. They pressured Marchand, made it clear that refusing would have consequences for his business relationships, his standing in the community, his ability to operate successfully in a social structure built on networks of mutual obligation. So the fights continued. Fight 33 against a man named Prometheus ended in 12 minutes, dead. Fight 34 against a man named Atlas lasted 19 minutes, dead. Fight 35 against a man named Hannibal went 27 minutes dead. Each fight added to Samuel's legend. 2. Each victory reinforced the growing belief among enslaved workers throughout the region that here was a man who couldn't be beaten, who'd found some way to transcend the ordinary limitations that kept them all trapped in this system. The stories took on embellishments. Samuel could see the future. Samuel had been blessed by some power. Samuel was going to lead them all to freedom. Samuel himself remained silent about such speculation. He fought when told to fight. He won every time. And he continued learning, continued listening, continued gathering information about the men who owned him and the system that supported them. Marchand's journal entries from this period reveal his growing unease. On November 23, 1850, he wrote, "The fights have become something I no longer control. Samuel wins, as he always does. But there's a quality to these victories that troubles me. He's not just defeating his opponents. He's sending a message to whom I cannot say." On December 8th, received word that 3 enslaved workers on the Roussel plantation attempted to resist their overseer. They invoked Samuel's name, claimed they were following his example. The situation was resolved with the usual measures, but it indicates a problem I had not foreseen. On January 14th, 1851, I have decided that the 36th fight will be the last. I will announce this to the other planters and make it clear that Samuel will no longer be available. The money has been substantial, but the cost in other ways has become too high. But Marchand never made that announcement because on January 19th, 1851, something happened that changed everything. A young overseer named Thomas Gaines, recently hired and eager to prove himself, decided that Samuel had been given too many privileges. He confronted Samuel near the stables, insisted that he perform some menial task immediately. Samuel, who'd been given specific instructions by Marchand to rest before the upcoming fight, explained this calmly. Gaines responded by striking him with a riding crop. What happened next was witnessed by 7 people. 4 enslaved workers, 2 other overseers, and a merchant who'd been visiting to discuss a business transaction with Marchand. Their accounts align in every significant detail. Samuel didn't retaliate. He simply turned and walked toward the main house, ignoring Gaines's shouted orders to stop. Gaines, furious at being disobeyed, raised the riding crop again and pursued. Marchand emerged from the house just as Gaines caught up to Samuel. He immediately understood what was happening and ordered Gaines to stand down. Gaines, too angry to think clearly, turned on Marchand and said something that several witnesses later refused to repeat in detail, though it apparently involved questioning Marin's authority and suggesting that his treatment of Samuel had created dangerous precedent. Marchand fired Gaines on the spot. Gaines left, but not before making his own prediction. "You've created something you can't control, and when it turns on you, don't say you weren't warned." That evening, Marchand sat in his study with his journal open, but unable to write. He'd been keeping these records for over 3 years, documenting every fight, every victory, every transaction. The journal had started as a business ledger, but had become something else, a chronicle of his own increasing discomfort with what he'd created. He finally wrote one sentence. Gaines was right, but he didn't stop. The 36th fight was already arranged, scheduled for February 2nd, 1851. The opponent was a man named Goliath, an almost comically on-nose name that suggested his owner's sense of drama, who belonged to a planter named Austin Boudreau. Boudreau had been breeding and training enslaved fighters for 5 years, and Goliath represented his most successful experiment. The fight was held on Boudreau's own plantation near Brobridge. More than 70 spectators attended, the largest crowd yet. The purse exceeded $1,000. Several planters had wagered additional amounts on side bets, creating a total pool of money that represented more than most Louisiana families would earn in 5 years. The fight began at 8 on a cold February evening. Goliath was enormous, 6 inches tall, weighing perhaps 250 pounds. He'd killed 4 previous opponents, and Boudreau had made certain everyone knew it. For the first time in 35 fights, Samuel seemed genuinely challenged. Goliath's size gave him reach advantages that Samuel couldn't easily overcome. His power was extraordinary. When his fists connected, the impact was audible throughout the crowd. Samuel absorbed punishment that should have ended the fight multiple times, but he remained standing, remained fighting, remained somehow untouchable in ways that transcended simple physical resilience. The fight lasted 42 minutes, the longest yet. Both men were bleeding, exhausted, operating on reserves of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human capacity. The crowd had gone silent, watching something that felt less like sport and more like a fundamental test of will. Samuel ended it with a combination of strikes that dropped Goliath to his knees. The final blow came when Goliath tried to rise, a strike to the side of the head that produced the distinctive sound everyone who'd been to these fights had learned to recognize, the sound of something vital breaking. Goliath collapsed forward and didn't move. The plantation doctor rushed forward, made his examination, and pronounced what everyone already knew. Dead on sight, Samuel stood in the center of the ring, swaying slightly, but still upright. Blood covered his face and torso. His left eye was swollen shut. His breathing came in ragged gasps, and when he looked at the crowd, something in his expression made several men step backward involuntarily. Martian collected the winnings, $1,400 total, and approached Samuel with unusual caution. "We're done," he said quietly. "No more fights. I mean it this time." Samuel's response was barely audible over the noise of the dispersing crowd. "One more, 37, Samuel said. "I need one more." Marchand wanted to refuse, wanted to end this before whatever was building finally erupted. But he looked into Samuel's eyes and understood that this wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. There would be one more fight whether Marchand agreed or not. "Why 37? Marchand asked. Samuel's answer was simple and terrible. "Because that's how many it takes." Marchand never recorded in his journal what he thought that meant. Perhaps he didn't want to know. The final fight took place on March 17th, 1851, at a location that had been kept secret until the day itself. A clearing on the edge of the Acafalaya Basin, far from any plantation house, accessible only by narrow paths through the swamp. The secrecy was necessary because by then law enforcement officials had started asking questions. Too many deaths? Too many suspicious circumstances? Too many rumors circulating among enslaved populations about a man who couldn't be beaten? The journey to the clearing began before dawn. Marchand arranged for Samuel to travel separately from the other spectators, taking a circuitous route through backwater channels that only the most experienced boatmen knew. The air was thick with morning fog, and the sounds of the swamp, the splash of alligators sliding into dark water, the calls of herons hunting in the shallows, created an atmosphere of primordial isolation. They arrived to find the clearing already prepared. Someone had spent considerable effort making this location suitable for what was to come. Torches had been driven into the ground at intervals, though they remained unlit in the morning light. A rough ring had been marked with rope staked into the soft earth. Wooden planks had been laid across the muddiest sections to provide stable footing for spectators who would pay premium prices for the best viewing positions. The opponent for this 37th fight was a man named Ajax, belonging to a planter named Leopold Crane. Crane had imported Ajax from somewhere in the Caribbean specifically for this purpose, spending nearly 18 months searching for a fighter he believed could finally defeat Samuel. Ajax had supposedly killed 9 men in fights across 3 different islands, and Crane had paid an extraordinary price to acquire him, $2,000, plus the promise of profitable business arrangements that would make the investment worthwhile if Ajax proved victorious. Ajax himself was brought to the clearing in chains, a precaution his owner insisted upon. He was massive, perhaps 6-7 inches tall, with a build that suggested both natural strength and years of forced conditioning. His face bore scars that testified to previous fights, and his eyes carried a particular quality, not rage exactly, but a kind of resigned determination. He'd learned, as all enslaved fighters learned, that survival meant winning, and winning meant doing whatever was necessary. But there was something else about this final fight, something that wasn't revealed until much later. Crane had made a separate arrangement with several other planters, including a man named Harrison Talbot, who'd lost significant money wagering against Samuel over the past year. They'd agreed on a simple plan. If Ajax couldn't beat Samuel in the ring, they would ensure Samuel didn't leave the clearing alive. They'd brought armed overseers, positioned them around the perimeter, given them explicit instructions. Rifles had been distributed. Escape routes had been blocked. This clearing deep in the swamp would become Samuel's grave one way or another. Marchant learned about this plan approximately an hour before the fight was scheduled to begin. An enslaved woman named Patience, who belonged to Talbert's cousin, had managed to overhear a conversation between the conspirators late the previous night. She understood enough to know that Samuel was walking into something more than just another fight. Patience had gotten word to her sister, who worked in the kitchen at a neighboring plantation. That sister had risked severe punishment to find Dina during the early morning hours. Dina, in turn, had found a way to tell Morong, passing him a note during the confusion of departure when dozens of people were preparing for the journey to the clearing. The message was brief, written in careful letters on a scrap of brown paper. They mean to kill him no matter what happens in the ring. Marchant faced a choice that would define everything that followed. He could warn Samuel, potentially saving his life, but destroying his own reputation and business relationships with men who controlled access to credit, shipping routes, and political influence throughout the region. Or he could stay silent, let events unfold as planned, and accept that he'd been complicit in creating this situation from the beginning. He'd made Samuel into what he'd become, a legend, a symbol, a problem that now needed to be eliminated. He chose neither option. Instead, he did something unexpected. He went to Samuel directly and told him everything. They stood near the edge of the clearing, away from the gathering spectators who were arriving in small groups throughout the morning. The swamp pressed in around them, alive with sounds and movement. Marchant had brought the note, showed it to Samuel, then explained what he'd learned about the conspiracy. He detailed who was involved, where the armed men were positioned, what the plan entailed. Samuel listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Marchant finished, there was a long silence broken only by the ambient sounds of the swamp. Finally, Samuel asked one question. "The people you promised to protect, Denina, Silas, Marcus, will they be safe?" "I'll make certain of it," Marshall said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. Over 3 years, these people had become more than just property to him, more than just leverage to control Samuel. They'd become a responsibility he took seriously, perhaps the only truly moral commitment he'd maintained in an enterprise built on exploitation and death. Samuel nodded slowly, processing this information with the same methodical approach he brought to everything. "Then it doesn't matter what they've planned. You can't fight if you know they're going to kill you anyway," Marchant said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can leave now, head to New Orleans, disappear before they realize what's happening. I have money set aside, we can buy passage on a ship, get you somewhere they can't reach. No." Samuel's voice was absolute, carrying a finality that made further argument pointless. 37 fights. That's what it takes. What does it take, Samuel? What are you talking about? But Samuel had already turned toward the ring, moving with the calm certainty of a man who'd made his peace with whatever was coming. Marchant wanted to grab him, force him to listen, make him understand that walking into that ring was walking into death. But something in Samuel's bearing made it clear that this wasn't ignorance or resignation. This was choice. By noon, more than 80 spectators had gathered, the largest crowd Samuel had ever faced. They represented wealth and power from across Louisiana and into Mississippi and Texas. Several had traveled for days to witness this fight, driven by curiosity about the legend Samuel had become. The purse exceeded $1,500 with side bets, bringing the total wagered to more than $5,000. Enough money to purchase a small plantation or establish a substantial business in New Orleans. The atmosphere was different from previous fights. There was excitement, certainly, but also tension that went beyond normal anticipation. Too many people knew about the conspiracy or suspected something or had simply picked up on the undertones of violence that extended beyond the official combat. Conversations were subdued. Men checked weapons they'd brought, ostensibly for protection during the journey through dangerous swamp territory, but the frequency of these checks suggested other purposes. The enslaved workers who'd been forced to attend, brought by their owners to handle logistics, serve refreshments, and provide labor, gathered in their own groups at the clearing's periphery. There were more than 40 of them from different plantations across the region. They spoke little, but their eyes moved constantly, assessing the situation, noting where the armed overseers stood, understanding without being told that something significant was about to happen. At 2, the fight was officially announced. The rules were recited, though everyone present knew they were largely theatrical. Samuel and Ajax would fight until one could no longer continue. No weapons beyond their own bodies, no interference from spectators. The winner's owner would collect the purse. The loser would be removed from the ring in whatever condition the fight left him. Ajax was released from his chains and led to the ring. He moved with controlled power, rolling his shoulders, testing his range of motion. His owner, Crane, spoke to him in a low voice, presumably offering final instructions or motivation. Whatever was said, Ajax's expression didn't change. He'd fought 9 times before. He knew what was expected. Samuel entered the ring from the opposite side. He wore only rough cotton trousers, his torso bare, his feet wrapped in cloth that provided minimal protection. At 6'4" and 230 pounds, he was slightly smaller than Ajax, but his body carried the evidence of 3 years of constant fighting, scars that marked where previous opponents had landed significant blows, muscles developed through violence rather than ordinary labor. The 2 men faced each other across perhaps 15 feet of cleared ground. The crowd fell silent. Even the swamp seemed to quiet, as if nature itself understood the significance of what was about to happen. A planter named Whitfield, who'd been chosen as the official timekeeper, raised his hand. "Fight begins when I lower my arm," he announced. "Continue until one man can no longer stand or defend himself." His arm dropped. For the first 30 seconds, neither fighter moved. They circled slowly, assessing each other, looking for tells that would indicate strategy or weakness. Ajax had reach advantages. His arms were longer, his strike range greater. But Samuel had experience with 36 previous opponents, and he'd learned to compensate for such differences. Ajax struck first, a probing jab that Samuel deflected easily. The blow was more about gathering information than causing damage. Ajax followed with a combination, testing Samuel's defenses, learning his patterns. Samuel absorbed 2 strikes and responded with his own, landing a solid blow to Ajax's ribs that produced an audible impact. The fight began in earnest. For the first 15 minutes, it proceeded like many of Samuel's previous contests. Ajax fought with skill and power, utilizing techniques that suggested formal training. He targeted specific areas. Samuel's already injured left eye from the Goliath fight, ribs that had never fully healed from earlier encounters, joints that years of fighting had weakened. His strategy was sound: accumulate damage, wear Samuel down, wait for the moment when accumulated injury would create an opening for a finishing blow. But Samuel had developed his own approach across 36 fights. He absorbed punishment that would have dropped most men and used that apparent vulnerability to create counterattack opportunities. When Ajax committed fully to what should have been a devastating strike to Samuel's temple, Samuel moved inside the blow and landed 3 rapid punches to Ajax's midsection. When Ajax tried to create distance, Samuel closed it, forcing close quarters combat where his slightly lower center of gravity gave him advantages. The crowd's reaction shifted as the fight progressed. Initial excitement gave way to something more primal, a recognition that they were witnessing something beyond ordinary violence. Both fighters were operating at levels that seemed to transcend normal human capacity. Ajax landed blows that should have ended the fight. Samuel absorbed them and continued forward. Samuel responded with combinations that should have crippled Ajax. Ajax remained standing, continued fighting, refused to fall. 20 minutes into the fight, both men were bleeding from multiple cuts. Samuel's left eye was nearly swollen shut. Ajax's breathing had become labored, suggesting damaged ribs. They moved more slowly now, conserving energy, but the intensity hadn't diminished. If anything, it had increased. Each strike carried the weight of desperation, the understanding that whoever faltered first would pay with their life. At the 25-minute mark, something changed. Samuel stopped defending, stopped trying to avoid Ajax's strikes. He walked forward, absorbing punishment that should have dropped him, and began his own assault. The strategy was shocking in its simplicity. Trade blow for blow, pain for pain, damage for damage, and trust that his will to survive would outlast his opponents. Ajax tried to retreat, tried to create the distance that would let him use his reach advantages, but Samuel kept coming. Each strike Samuel landed seemed to carry all the accumulated anger of 36 previous fights, 3 years of being forced to perform for the entertainment of men who considered him property. A lifetime of systematic dehumanization that had tried and failed to break something essential inside him. The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching something that felt less like sport and more like a fundamental test of human will. Several spectators looked away. Others leaned forward, unable to tear their eyes from what was happening. The enslaved workers at the clearing's edge stood perfectly still, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. The fight lasted 33 minutes total. It ended when Samuel landed a final blow to Ajax's temple, a strike that everyone present knew was fatal. Even before Ajax began to fall, his body went rigid, then collapsed forward into the mud. The plantation doctor rushed into the ring, made his examination with practiced efficiency, and pronounced what everyone already knew: Ajax was dead. Samuel stood in the center of the ring, swaying slightly but still upright. Blood covered most of his face and torso, mixing with sweat and mud until he looked like something that had emerged from the swamp itself rather than walked into it. His breathing came in ragged gasps that suggested damaged ribs or worse. His left eye was completely closed. His right hand hung at an odd angle, possibly broken from the force of his final strikes, but he was standing. After 37 fights, after killing 37 men, he was still standing. He looked directly at the crowd, and something in his expression made several men step backward involuntarily. There was no triumph in that look, no satisfaction, only a kind of terrible awareness, the understanding of what he'd become, what he'd been forced to become, and what that meant for everyone present. Talbot, standing near the clearing's edge with his armed overseers positioned nearby, gave a signal. It was subtle, just a slight nod, but its meaning was clear. The overseers raised their rifles, aiming at Samuel from 3 different angles. The plan was proceeding as arranged. Ajax had failed to win in the ring, so Samuel would die anyway, cut down by gunfire and left in the swamp where his body would disappear into the dark water. But before anyone could fire, something extraordinary happened. The enslaved workers who'd been gathered at the clearing's periphery, more than 40 of them from different plantations across the region, owned by different men with different interests, stepped forward simultaneously. They didn't speak, didn't make threats, didn't do anything that could be explicitly called rebellion. They simply moved between Samuel and the armed men, creating a human barrier that would require shooting through them to reach their intended target. For a long moment, absolutely no one moved. The tension was so absolute that even breathing seemed dangerous. The armed overseers looked to Tolbert for orders, their rifles still raised, but their fingers hesitating on the triggers. Tolbert looked at the other planters who'd been part of the conspiracy, trying to gauge whether they would support him if this turned into actual violence. The planters looked at each other, suddenly realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond their control. The calculation was complex and happened in seconds. Shooting Samuel meant shooting through enslaved workers who belonged to other planters, which meant destroying property that wasn't theirs to destroy. It meant potential legal liability, financial consequences, and the breaking of unwritten rules that governed relationships between men of their class. It meant transforming what was supposed to be a quiet elimination into something that would require explanations, investigations, official scrutiny, but more than that, it meant confronting the reality they'd all been avoiding for 3 years. Samuel had never been alone. Every fight, every victory, every death in those makeshift rings had been witnessed by enslaved people who'd carried the story back to their own communities. Samuel had become a symbol, a living proof that the system could be resisted, that strength could be maintained even under circumstances designed to break it. Killing him now, in front of 40 witnesses who would spread the story throughout the region, risked creating a martyr whose legend would be more dangerous than the living man. Marchand broke the stalemate. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the armed men and the barrier of enslaved workers, and addressed the gathered crowd with a voice that carried across the clearing. "The fight is over. Samuel has won according to the rules we all agreed upon. Anyone who has a problem with that outcome can take it up with me directly through proper legal channels if necessary." It was a remarkable moment. A planter openly defying other planters, placing himself between his property and their intentions, invoking the very legal structures they all usually ignored when convenient. Several men protested immediately. Talbert's face went red with rage. Crane, who'd just lost his fighter and his substantial investment, shouted that the entire situation was unjust. But Marchand had established himself over 3 years as Samuel's owner, and there were rules about such things, unwritten, but understood within their social structure. To kill another man's property without cause was theft, and theft had consequences, even among men who'd built their wealth on stealing human lives. The fact that Samuel had won the fight according to the agreed-upon rules gave Marchand legal standing, however thin. More importantly, Marchand had allies present, men who'd profited from Samuel's fights over the years, who'd won significant money betting on his victories, who owed Marshall favors or had business relationships they wanted to maintain. Several of these men now spoke up, pointing out that changing the rules after the fact would undermine the entire enterprise, would make future arrangements impossible, would create chaos in a system that depended on certain protocols being observed. The moment stretched, balanced on the edge of violence, and then passed. The armed overseers lowered their rifles, though their expressions made clear they did so reluctantly. Talbert made threats that everyone present knew were empty. He would pursue legal action. He would report these illegal fights to authorities. He would make certain Marchand regretted this decision. The other conspirators muttered their own complaints, but began moving toward the boats that would carry them away from the clearing. The crowd dispersed slowly, their voices a mixture of anger, excitement, and uncertainty. Many were calculating how this would affect their own interests, their relationships with Marshall and the other planters involved. Several looked back at Samuel, still standing in the center of the ring, as if trying to memorize what they'd witnessed. Within an hour, the clearing was nearly deserted. The torches were extinguished. The ropes marking the ring were collected. Enslaved workers moved efficiently to erase evidence of what had occurred, knowing that the less visible proof remaining, the less likely official investigations would uncover details that could create problems for everyone involved. Marchand approached Samuel, who still stood in the center of what had been the ring. The swamp was already beginning to reclaim the space, water seeping in where planks had been removed, mud covering the areas that had been cleared for spectators. "We need to leave," Marshall said quietly. "Now, before they change their minds or gather reinforcements," Samuel nodded, but didn't move immediately. He was looking at the enslaved workers who'd stepped forward to protect him, who were now preparing for their own departures under the watchful eyes of their respective owners. His gaze moved from face to face, memorizing them, acknowledging what they'd risked with a look that carried more weight than any words could. Then he turned to Marchand and said something that would appear in Marchand's journal later that night, written in handwriting that shook despite his efforts at control. 37 fights, 37 victories, 37 men dead because you and men like you decided we were property instead of people. I hope it was worth the money you made. The words weren't spoken with anger or accusation. They were simply stated as fact, an observation about what had happened and what it had cost, but they landed with the weight of absolute truth. And Marchand felt something break inside him, some final defense he'd maintained, some way of thinking about what he'd done that had allowed him to sleep at night. They left the clearing together, but the relationship between them had fundamentally changed. The transaction that had governed their interaction for 3 years, fights in exchange for protection, violence in exchange for privileges, had been fulfilled and found wanting. Samuel had held up his end. He'd fought when told to fight. He'd won 37 times. He'd killed 37 men. The debt between them was beyond any calculation of money or obligation. The journey back through the swamp took place in silence. Marchand arranged for Samuel to be taken to a cabin on the far edge of his plantation property, away from the main house and the other enslaved workers. A doctor was brought in, one who could be trusted to ask no questions to treat Samuel's injuries. The assessment was grim: 3 broken ribs, a fractured hand, severe contusions across most of his body, and a concussion that would require weeks of careful monitoring. But Samuel would survive, as he always had, as he always would, despite every attempt to destroy him. That night, Marshall sat in his study with his leather-bound journal open before him. He'd been keeping these records for 3 years and 2 months, documenting every fight, every victory, every transaction. 37 entries, each one noting the opponent's name, the length of the fight, the outcome. He'd tracked Samuel's diet, his training regimen, his physical condition. He'd calculated profits, recorded expenses, maintained the kind of detailed business ledger that any successful planter would keep. Now he read through those entries, page after page of careful handwriting, and tried to understand what he'd created. When had this stopped being about profit? When had Samuel stopped being property and become something Marchand couldn't quite name? When had the fights transformed from entertainment into something that felt like ongoing horror? He never found satisfactory answers to these questions. Instead, he wrote one final entry: "The 37th fight has concluded. Samuel remains undefeated. I pray to God that I never see another such contest, though I know the guilt of what I've orchestrated will follow me until my dying day." Then he closed the journal and locked it in his desk drawer, where it would remain for the next 28 years. The aftermath of that 37th fight rippled outward in ways that couldn't be contained or controlled. Word spread not just about Samuel's final victory, but about what had happened afterward. Enslaved workers defying armed overseers, planters turning on each other, the entire system showing cracks that suggested deeper instability. The story was carried by enslaved people traveling between plantations, by overseers gossiping in Opelousas taverns, by planters writing letters to business associates in other parishes. Within 2 weeks, some version of the events at the Atchafalaya clearing had reached communities throughout Louisiana and into Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. The immediate consequences were varied and complex. Several planters who'd participated in the conspiracy faced uncomfortable questions from local authorities who'd been investigating reports of illegal fighting operations. While none were ultimately charged with crimes, the power structures that governed Louisiana protected men of their class from serious legal consequences. The scrutiny created problems for their business operations and social standing. Tolbert, in particular, found himself facing financial difficulties when creditors who'd heard about his involvement began demanding early payment on outstanding debts. Crane, who'd lost both his fighter and his substantial investment, attempted to pursue legal action against Marshall, claiming fraud or breach of contract or something that would justify compensation. The case went nowhere. The entire enterprise had been illegal from the beginning, which meant no court would acknowledge the transactions involved. Crane was forced to absorb his losses, and his reputation suffered accordingly. Other planters saw him as a man who'd broken the unwritten rules, not by participating in illegal fights, but by trying to seek legal remedy for illegal activities. But the more significant consequences played out in communities that existed outside the official structures of power and documentation among enslaved populations throughout the region. The story of Samuel's 37 victories became something more than entertainment or gossip. It became evidence of possibility. Here was a man who'd been forced into circumstances designed to destroy him, who'd found ways not just to survive, but to maintain his humanity, his connections to others, his capacity for strategic thought even under the most oppressive conditions. The details were elaborated, embellished, transformed through each retelling. Some versions claimed Samuel had freed dozens of people directly. Others said he'd killed twice as many men as the documented 37. Still others suggested he possessed some special quality, not supernatural exactly, but something that set him apart, made him capable of things ordinary men couldn't accomplish. These embellishments didn't diminish the story's power. If anything, they amplified it, turning Samuel from a specific individual into a symbol that could carry meanings beyond his actual experiences. Marchand kept his promises with a thoroughness that surprised even him. Within 2 weeks of the final fight, Dina received her freedom papers along with $150, enough money to establish herself in New Orleans with prospects beyond simple survival. She left on March 31st, traveling with a merchant family who owed Marchand favors and could provide safe escort. Marchand never saw her again, though he received 2 letters over the following years confirming that she'd established herself successfully as a seamstress, had married, had started a family. The letters thanked him, though the gratitude felt hollow given everything that had led to her freedom. Silas received his papers on April 7th, along with $100 and a letter of introduction to a free black community in Mobile. He was older, nearly 50, and the transition to freedom after decades of enslavement was difficult in ways that documentation couldn't capture. But he adapted, found work as a carpenter, lived quietly until his death in 1867. His grandchildren would later tell stories about their ancestor who'd known the legendary Samuel, who'd been part of something significant, even if the full details remained unclear. Marcus, the boy who'd followed Samuel around the stables, who'd been perhaps 10 years old when all this began, presented more complicated challenges. He was young enough that freedom without family or support structures could be dangerous. Marchand arranged for him to be apprenticed to a free black carpenter in Opelousas, a man named Thibodeau, who could provide both training and protection. The arrangement cost Marchand $200 plus ongoing financial support, but he paid it without complaint. Marcus learned the carpenter's trade, eventually established his own successful business, and lived until 1903. He named his first son Samuel. Samuel himself remained on Marchand's plantation, but their relationship had transformed into something unprecedented in the slave-owning South. Marchand offered freedom papers as well, prepared the documentation, and presented it to Samuel barely 2 weeks after the final fight. The conversation that followed was brief and troubling. "I'm giving you your freedom," Marchand said, holding out the papers. "You've earned it 1,000 times over. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want. You'll never have to fight again." Samuel looked at the papers but didn't take them. "What about the others?" "What others?" "Everyone else still enslaved on this plantation. Everyone still enslaved throughout this parish. Everyone still suffering under the same system that forced me to kill 37 men for your profit." Mash had no answer for that. He stood there holding the freedom papers, feeling their inadequacy in ways that went beyond words. Finally, Samuel spoke again. "I'll stay, not as your property. Those days are over, and we both know it. But I'll stay because there's work to do that can't be done from New Orleans or Mobile or anywhere else. Free black people are trying to survive in a world that doesn't want them to exist." What work? Samuel's answer was oblique, but its meaning was clear to anyone who understood the context. The kind of work that takes patience, planning, and knowledge about how the system operates. The kind of work you learn by spending 3 years watching wealthy men gather in secret places, listening to them talk about their businesses, their relationships, their vulnerabilities, the kind of work that can't be rushed and can't be done alone. Marchand understood then, or thought he did. Samuel had spent 3 years learning how the plantation economy functioned, who controlled access to credit and shipping and political influence, where the weak points were in a system that appeared absolute. He'd been gathering intelligence, making connections, preparing for something that extended beyond his own individual freedom. "That's dangerous," Marchand said. "If you're caught organizing resistance—" "I'm not organizing resistance," Samuel interrupted. "I'm just staying on your plantation and doing whatever work you assign me. If other people, through their own independent choices, happen to gain their freedom through channels that can't be directly traced back to me, well, that's just coincidence." It was said with perfect blandness, as if Samuel were discussing the weather or the sugar harvest, but the implication was clear. He intended to use his position, his reputation, and the knowledge he'd gained to systematically undermine the system from within, not through open rebellion, which would be crushed immediately, but through patient, careful action that would be nearly impossible to detect or prevent. Marin should have refused, should have forced Samuel to take the Freedom Papers and leave, removing the potential danger from his property, should have reported his suspicions to other planters or local authorities. Instead, he found himself nodding slowly and asking, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing. Just continue treating me as you have been, as if I have some special status that sets me apart from the other enslaved workers. It creates cover, makes it easier to move around, talk to people, arrange things, and don't ask questions about things you don't want to know the answers to." So began a period that would last nearly 3 years, during which Marchand's plantation became known for an unusually high number of enslaved workers receiving their freedom through various channels. Sometimes it was manumission arranged through legal channels. Sometimes it was workers purchased by intermediaries who then granted freedom. Sometimes people simply disappeared, heading north through networks that somehow always seemed to have resources and information available when needed. Local authorities investigated multiple times. They questioned Marand, searched his records, interviewed his overseers. They found nothing that could be proven illegal. Manumission was unusual but legal. If enslaved people ran away, well, that happened on every plantation occasionally. If some of those runaways seemed to have unusually good intelligence about safe routes and reliable contacts, that could be coincidence. But Marchand knew better. He watched Samuel move through the plantation, observed the quiet conversations that happened in stables and fields and processing sheds. He saw the way information flowed through channels that official power structures never accessed. He understood that something systematic was happening, something that drew on 3 years of accumulated knowledge about how the system worked and where its vulnerabilities lay. The fights themselves ended completely. Marchand made it clear to other planters that Samuel would never fight again, that the enterprise they'd built was finished. Most accepted this, having witnessed what happened at the Acapulco, clearing and understanding that continuing would create more problems than profits. A few tried to arrange their own fighting operations using other enslaved men, but none achieved the same level of organization or drew the same crowds. The moment had passed. Marin destroyed his journal or claimed to. In reality, he removed certain pages, the ones containing details that could implicate other planters in illegal activities, and burned those. The remaining pages he kept locked in his desk, a record of something he couldn't fully articulate. Years later, after his death, these pages would be found by his grandson, who would eventually donate them to a historical society with the notation documentation of activities my grandfather regretted but believed should be remembered. The broader historical record remained deliberately incomplete. Newspaper accounts from the period made no direct mention of the fights, though several referenced disturbances and illegal gatherings in language vague enough to encompass almost anything. Official government records contain no documentation of Samuel's existence beyond basic property listings that appeared and disappeared across several years. The 37 men who died in those rings were recorded when they were recorded at all, as having died from various causes, fever, accident, heart failure, that obscured the true circumstances. This wasn't unusual. The system of slavery depended on controlling not just bodies but information, maintaining official narratives that erased anything that might complicate the fundamental fiction that enslaved people were property rather than human beings. Events like the fighting rings existed in the shadows, acknowledged by those who participated, but never documented in ways that would create legal or political consequences. Samuel himself disappeared from the historical record sometime in early 1854. No death certificate exists, no sale was recorded, no further documentation places him in Louisiana or anywhere else. The most reliable accounts pieced together from letters and oral histories collected decades later suggest he simply left one morning, walking away from Marchand's plantation with the same calm certainty he'd brought to everything else. Some stories claimed he went north, joining the networks that would eventually become the Underground Railroad. Others suggested he stayed in the South, continuing the work he'd begun, helping others find paths to freedom. Still others said he disappeared into the Acapulco Basin, becoming one of the Maroons who lived in the swamp beyond the reach of plantation authority. The truth, whatever it was, remained elusive. Marchand himself lived until 1879, dying at the age of 70. His obituary in the Opelousas newspaper made no mention of the fights, no reference to Samuel, nothing that suggested the extraordinary events that had shaped his middle years. He'd become, by all accounts, a relatively unremarkable retired planter, remembered primarily for his business acumen and his unexpected support for certain Reconstruction policies that gave limited rights to formerly enslaved people. But a letter was found among his effects after his death, dated April 15, 1865, the day after Lincoln's assassination. It contained 2 paragraphs written in handwriting that wavered between careful control and barely contained emotion. I have lived with the knowledge of what I did for 24 years. I forced a man to kill 37 others for my profit and entertainment. I told myself I was protecting him, giving him privileges, maintaining my part of a bargain. The truth is simpler. I was using him, exploiting the one thing he had left, his strength and his will to protect others. The fact that he survived, that he somehow transcended what I tried to make him into, is no credit to me. It is a testament to something in him that I never understood and never will. If there is a God, and if that God is just, then I will be held accountable for those 37 deaths and for every other sin I committed in the name of profit. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I can only hope that the small actions I took in later years, the freedoms I granted, the money I provided, the support I gave to Reconstruction efforts might count for something in the final reckoning. But I doubt they will. Some debts cannot be paid. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Marchand's journal entries from years before. His family found it troubling enough that they considered destroying it, but ultimately decided to preserve it with his other papers. It would eventually find its way to an archive at Louisiana State University, where it remains available to researchers studying the period. The question of whether Samuel's story was real or embellished, fact or legend, continued to be debated among historians who encountered fragments of documentation over the following decades. Fight records were sparse and often contradictory. The few official documents that mentioned anything resembling these events used language so vague as to be nearly meaningless. Newspaper accounts were similarly unhelpful, either silent on the topic or making oblique references that could mean almost anything. But among the descendants of enslaved workers from Street, Landry Parish, and surrounding areas, the story remained remarkably consistent in its essential details. There was a man called Samuel, sometimes called the Bayou Giant, who fought 37 times and was never beaten, who killed 37 men, not because he wanted to, but because he was given no choice, who used those fights to learn about the system that enslaved him and eventually found ways to dismantle it from within, who understood that true freedom wasn't about winning fights, but about changing the circumstances that made the fights necessary. The specific details varied with each telling. The exact dates shifted, the names changed, the locations became less precise, but the core truth persisted, passed down through generations who understood its significance not as literal history, but as deeper truth about resistance, survival, and the indestructible human spirit that even the worst systems could never fully break. In 1932, a researcher named Elizabeth Hartwell working for the Federal Writers Project, interviewed a woman named Sarah Desmond, who was then 93 years old and living in New Orleans. Sarah's grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Opelousas during the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds. The interview was preserved in the Library of Congress archives. My grandmother told me about a man who fought for white men's entertainment but never let them break his spirit. She said he was the strongest person she ever knew, not because of his body, but because of his mind. He understood things about the world that took the rest of them years to learn. When the war came and freedom finally arrived, there were dozens of people throughout the parish who credited him with helping them survive until that day came. She said his real victory wasn't the fights he won, but the people he saved. When Hartwell asked if Sarah's grandmother had known this man personally, the response was carefully ambiguous. She knew him well enough to understand what he represented. That was all anyone needed to know. The clearing on the edge of the Acapulco Basin, where that final fight took place, was reclaimed by the swamp within years. Water rose, vegetation took over, and within a decade, no trace remained of what had happened there. The swamp erased evidence the way it erased everything eventually, not through violence, but through patient, inevitable reclamation. But the memory persisted. Local people, particularly descendants of enslaved families, would sometimes point to that general area and tell stories about what had happened there. The details varied, but the themes remained constant. Violence forced upon people who found ways to survive it. Resistance that took forms the oppressors never anticipated. Human dignity maintained even under circumstances designed to destroy it. Whether Samuel himself lived to see the end of slavery, whether he died free or enslaved, whether he existed exactly as described or was a composite of multiple people's experiences, these questions remained open. The historical record was deliberately incomplete, maintained by people who had every incentive to erase such stories from official memory. But the story survived anyway, preserved in oral traditions, in fragmentary documents, in the collective memory of communities that understood its importance. It survived because it represented something essential about the period, about the system of slavery, about human resistance to oppression. It survived because whether every detail was literally true or not, the fundamental truth it represented was undeniable. By the early 20th century, Samuel's name had already slipped into legend, passed quietly from porch to porch, church to church, across black communities in Louisiana and far beyond its borders. The details of his life blurred over time, folding into other stories of defiance and survival, but the name itself never disappeared. Parents spoke of him when teaching their children what strength truly meant. Community elders invoked him when reminding younger generations that resistance had many forms, and scholars sifted through whatever scraps of documentation remained, trying never with complete success to pull the man out from behind the myth, knowing that even the attempt carried its own importance. In 1968, in the heat of the civil rights era, a young activist named Marcus Johnson, named after the boy who had once trailed Samuel around the stables more than a century earlier, published an essay about the legend in a Black history journal. His conclusion captured the heart of the matter. We may never know the full truth of Samuel's life, or whether every story attached to him is literal fact. But what we do know is this: during one of the darkest chapters in American history, enslaved people found ways to resist, to hold on to their humanity, to protect one another, and to endure long enough to see freedom break through. Samuel's story, whether strictly historical or symbolically true, stands for the countless acts of courage that kept hope alive when hope was not allowed. And so the story lived on. It shifted, expanded, and adapted, taking on new meaning with every generation. Some people see in it a portrait of personal power. Others view it as proof of quiet, organized resistance. Still others read it as a sobering reminder of the violence and impossible choices forced upon the enslaved. All these interpretations hold truth. Samuel fought those 37 battles because he was given no other path. He killed those 37 men because the system demanded brutality for entertainment and profit. He survived because something inside him refused to break, no matter how insistently the world tried to shatter him. And he used that survival, what was meant to imprison him, as a tool to help others find their way toward freedom. His violence, forced upon him, became a form of resistance no plantation owner could have predicted. What do you make of this story? Do you believe we've uncovered everything? Or do you feel, deep in the cypress shadows of Louisiana, that more truths still lie buried, waiting to surface? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this tale of endurance, resistance, and hidden history moved you, make sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share it with someone who appreciates the untold stories of America's past. The truth is always more complex than legend, and the past holds more secrets than we can ever fully uncover. See you in the next video. Tentaran novant.